All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to March's edition of the InterReach webinar series. We are continuing with our wonderful series on boundary spanning tools for research teams. And today's session is on conflict transformation, and we'll hear more about our speakers and the session from our wonderful host, Bethany Larson. Thank you so much for being here, Bethany. And I also just want to say that if anyone is interested in participating in our InterReach Reading Club, we have that happening on the fourth Tuesday of every month. And we would love to take your suggestions for books or articles that we can read as a group. So I'm dropping the link to the suggestion form into the chat. So if you're interested in dropping in any suggestions for the group to read together, whether it's on something we learn about today or something else that you're experiencing in your professional interdisciplinary integration research career life, then just let us know, and we're happy to take those suggestions. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Bethany.
Great. Thank you, Christine. And to Christine Hendren, who is also an intellectual sponsor of this series and of InterReach in general. This is all done through volunteer efforts of love. We do not have consistent funding for this. This is funded by everyone's energy and commitment. So thank you for showing up, bringing your best creativity, your open minds, and your willingness to learn today. We have two wonderful presenters to talk about the tricky, but really a topic full of potential is actually conflict. And instead of conflict resolution, we wanted to call it conflict transformation, because it is about redirecting that conflicting energy into a productive problem-solving interaction. You either learn about each other or you actually solve a problem. Again, we're going to see some ways today to do that, make a way forward when there doesn't seem to be one. So Christine, if you could drop our links into the chat for our growing inventory of tools that are being covered in this webinar series this spring. And I have turned on the comments feature for that, so that as you get an idea or it reminds you of another link to another resource or tool, you can drop those resources or those questions directly into that inventory, and we can have a community conversation in the margins of this document. So that's one way to continue interacting with each other during today and after as we move forward. The other link is for our boundary spanning field notebook. This is your own personal learning journal, and you can print it out or fill it out on the screen on your computer as we move through every tool. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Hannah Love, who is a team scientist and professional facilitator. She works full-time as a team science consultant with her own business, Divergent Science LLC. Her background includes 12 years of facilitation experience in higher education, water conflict, and science facilitation. And since 2015, she has been designing trainings, retreats, and workshops for scientific teams in particular. Follow her on Twitter and on Instagram. Those handles are in the inventory. And with that, please lead us, Hannah.
All right, let me share my screen here. Oh, hold on. Bethany, I think it did it again. I shared the wrong one. Here we go. All right, do you have the right screen up? Just checking. Cool, thank you so much. All right, Bethany, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm excited to be here with you all today, and I'm really excited to talk about this tool, the gradients of agreement. Bethany mentioned that I'm a team science consultant for Divergent Science LLC, and that's actually where I kind of want to start today, is talking just a little bit about divergent thinking. When a team engages in divergent thinking, They brainstorm or write down all the possible ideas or all the possible solutions before they converge, or as we're going to talk about today, use these gradients of agreement. And so I have a slide here where I'm going to talk about this just a little bit, and here's why. So this is Kaner. This is the book where this comes from. And where the decision making and innovation, we're on page like 25 here, so I've got a rogue sticky note. And the gradients are on page 275. So I want to provide just a little bit of background of these 275 pages. So this is what Kaner calls decision-making and innovation. And I have 4 steps, trying to break this down, make it as easy as possible. Step 1 is divergent thinking. And this is when you brainstorm all the different ideas. So I have these represented with a lot of different colorful dots. Step 2, you enter the groan zone. And so notice there's fewer dots. The groan zone is synonymous with what Tuckman calls storming. So you might have heard of forming, storming, norming, and performing. In facilitation literature, they often call this the groan zone. So again, groan zone, storming, very similar. And then you converge. You start to come together on what's going to be your final idea. And then step 4, you use the gradients to make a decision. And teams engage in this process of divergence and convergence over and over again. So a team might start off and they get going and they need to make a decision. They brainstorm everything, make a decision, they converge. They do it again, and they do it over and over again. And this is the logo for our consulting business, Divergent Science, because we think that this process is really, really important. And so there's this whole diagram, there's a whole book on this, and we're really focusing today on this kind of final part of this convergence and how do you make a decision. So how do people actually make decisions on teams? There are a lot of claims and people will report back a lot of different things like, hey, we voted on this, or you might reach a consensus. Maybe what you're doing just requires a unanimous decision. Maybe you compromise. Some people gave a little, other people gave a little, and you came out with a different outcome than you originally intended, but it's a compromise. You might just decide not to decide, and many more options. But let's talk a little bit also about how decisions are actually made. So often, the loudest voice wins, or the person in charge makes the decision, or sometimes people think that silence means agreement, and silence is actually what made the decision. And again, many more here. I'm just listing a few. So Kaner proposes using the gradients of agreement. And I like this example because it has the 1 through 8 gradients, like wholehearted agreement, agreement with minor point of contention in bold. And then below it has italic quotes of what this might really mean. So wholehearted agreement is like, yeah, I really like it. Whereas if you agree with a minor point of contention, you're like, yeah, it's not perfect, but it's good enough. And on our scientific teams, when we're making decisions, we don't always need wholehearted agreement. A lot of times you might not like it, but you just need to be able to live with it. I think of a lot of budget decisions on teams. Usually we're out of money. And so I don't have wholehearted agreement to what we're deciding, but I just need to live with it. It just needs to be at a level where, yeah, it's the best case scenario with what we've got. A few things to keep in mind with this tool. It's important to remember and to have a conversation ahead of time about what level of agreement is necessary before you move forward. And we're going to talk a lot about this. Do you need wholehearted agreement, or is it okay if you just have lukewarm agreement? There are a lot of benefits to using this. I'm going to talk about this now, and then I'll recap it again at the end. This is about conflict today. Using a gradient can transform conflict because it's no longer a yes and no decision. It presents a whole spectrum of opportunities. And it allows people to, in a less aggressive way, say, hey, I'm not done talking about this, or nope, this like absolutely won't work for me. We've mentioned a few of these others already. Using a gradient means the loudest voice is not always going to win. Everyone feels heard. the person with the most power doesn't make the final decision. Anyone who's worked with me knows I'm a huge advocate for graduate students on interdisciplinary teams. In my research, I saw graduate students bridging disciplines, bridging departments. They have friends outside of their discipline. And structurally at universities, they have an outside committee member who they're typically working with and talking to. And so bringing their voice into a room I think is very key. And finally, using this presents an opportunity to practice diversity, equity, and inclusion, because it's an easy step to hear more voices in the room. One final note before we start into this: when you use this with your teams, you might need to repeat the process 2 or 5 times. So just like I showed my diamonds at the beginning going on and on, you might have to poll people numerous times in order to finally get to a decision. So today we're going to practice 3 ways to use the gradients of agreement. And I have come up with fun, silly questions. I hope they make you smile. I hope they make you feel good inside. These are not philosophical. You will not have to think. And I hope that they garner some different levels of support so that we can see what these look like on a gradient and then hopefully have some conversations about them at the end. So practical application number 1, we're going to practice using a Zoom poll. One of the major benefits is that you can preload a gradient and you don't have to have the question there. And when I was doing this, I was thinking about my time when I was in Student Senate. When we needed to call a question, we had this really funky hand signal we'd do. And we'd say, okay, call the question, call the question. And you don't always know what your question's gonna be heading into a team meeting. Sometimes someone's just gonna be like, all right, I'm ready to vote on this, call the question. And so we have a gradient on a poll, Zoom poll with just a question mark at the top so that you can fill in whatever question's right for your team. So my fun, silly poll question is, do you want to spend summer vacation at the beach? And I think Christine or Bethany is going to go ahead and launch this poll, and you can see the gradients of agreement up there. And let me know what you think. I can see results coming in. This is looking great. Nobody's vetoing the idea yet, which is perfect.
Serious disagreement though.
All right, just a few more seconds if you want to get a vote in. Okay, I am going to end this polling. Oh, here we go. All right, so we got wholehearted endorsement 1, which is kind of what I was hoping for. I was hoping for a lot of agreement on this poll. We have some serious disagreement. That's, obviously we would need to talk about that, but in general, people are excited about this. Let me move to the next slide. Here we go. So I was hoping to get pretty enthusiastic support about this. And so I'm going to end this poll, get this off our screens. My thought was, y'all haven't been able to travel for over a year now, and you can't wait to travel again. So, maybe a beach would sound great. Enthusiastic support, more importantly, is necessary when there's high stakes and the decision's important. There's a long-term impact and the decision impacts the team for an extended period of time. Or there's a tough problem when there's a lot of money involved or a lot of stakeholder buy-in, or you need to empower group members. These are times when you really want that wholehearted, like a lot of buy-in. We're going to walk through an example. Give me a second, my slides aren't progressing. Okay, in this next example, I'm hoping for a different level of support, and we'll talk about when you need that and what that means. The next way we're going to practice this is using a Google slide. And Bethany graciously had this idea and is letting me use it, so I want to give her full credit. Again, the benefit is that you can preload this gradient without the question. And there are a lot of platforms that you can use that are similar. So like Jamboards, Padlet, Miro, and many more. One of the benefits of this one too, when you see it, I'm going to have you put your name on it. And so you'll write your name on it and you can drag your response. So there are times where you might want a record. And this would be one of those instances where you can get a record of who voted for what. So my fun, silly question for you today is, would you enjoy eating broccoli cheese soup for lunch tomorrow? So if we could make sure that the Google slides in the chat, I think it is, I think I saw it come in.
Christina, I think you got, yeah, there you go.
I got it.
You got it.
And I will give you all just a second to write your names, vote about if you would enjoy eating broccoli cheese soup for lunch tomorrow. And we'll just kind of quickly look at what kind of support we have. I'm going to stop sharing for 1 second.
And if you run out of a little square, that doesn't mean we don't love you. Just copy one and make a new one for yourself.
You might also notice that I modified the scale a little bit for this. It didn't fit well on my gradient, so I thought, yeah, we're just going to start modifying it already, and I'll show you a lot more adaptations before the end today. I'm really surprised how much endorsement we have for this idea.
This is great because we are also seeing some things we might need to facilitate when we try this, where like people are accidentally clicking on the wrong thing or like, and that's great. This is a great learning opportunity. So you can imagine how you might instruct people, you know, to help coach them through that, or maybe you've scaffolded another thing that's before this, before they, you know, so they know how to interact with the slide.
Definitely. Okay. All right, I'm going to share my screen one more time. Bethany, it's doing it again. When I click share screen, it's being all funky.
Sorry.
It's not your phone. Why is it doing this? Okay, dive it again. Cool. All right, so what I was hoping for, which we saw quite a bit of this in this gradient, is some lukewarm support. Not all of you were just thrilled about the idea of having broccoli cheese soup for lunch tomorrow. And the thing is that sometimes lukewarm support's okay. I already gave the example of budgets, but here's a list of other times when you just need lukewarm support. When it's low stakes, when it's short term, when it's a simple problem, there's not much money involved, or there's low autonomy, meaning not everyone needs to feel empowered. And this is another place where using a gradient can really help with conflict, because if somebody's like, yeah, no, I'm not really into that, it might not mean like, hey, I don't support this, or like, no, I'm not okay with you moving forward. And so voting might not be your best idea. It just means like, yeah, we've got budget cuts and I'm not excited about any of these, but I understand that we have to do it to move forward. So places that hopefully gradients can help. All right, for this last one, we're just going to use some simple hand signals. This is a way that you can really quickly get a feel of your audience. It's fast, it's non-committal, so there's no record of your vote. So you could vote 8 this time and you could vote 1 next time and nobody will know. And you can quickly see where everybody stands. So I'm going to make this big so I can see everybody. And then my question is, should the team adopt a pet? And if you have wholehearted endorsement, number 1. If you're going to veto this idea, number 8. If you want to just abstain, number 4. Again, make your screen big so you can see people who have their camera on, and let's see your hand signals. Lots of 1s, 5s. I think I've got like an 8 and a 7, lots of 1s, 5s, 5s. Okay, so hopefully you can see how this might work if you're just really quickly trying to pull the audience. And again, it can also be a little trick to get people to turn their cameras on if you're having a heated discussion and you really want to see what's going on. So what I was hoping with that one is that we'd get just a little bit of ambiguous support or some outliers. And so when you have ambiguous support or outliers, you need to keep talking. Remember from the very beginning, the ground zone, a lot of this book is talking about what do you do when you're in the ground zone. And so this is a really quick way to know, hey, people aren't happy yet. We really need to continue having this conversation. And so often when you spend a little more time discussing, helping people feel a little more comfortable, answering a few more questions, it really decreases conflict on a team because people feel heard and they feel better about what's going on. This is also a point if you realize, hey, this is ambiguous and we're not getting through it, that a facilitator or a science facilitator is really helpful because they can ask different questions to help your team get through the ground zone. They can provide different tools, and sometimes they'll bring in a different lens about how things work. All right, so we've made it through these 3 applications. I'm going to briefly run through a couple adaptations. We're going to reflect a little bit and then open this up for conversation. If you Google gradients of decision making or different variations of this, gradients of agreement, there are a lot of scales. So this is one I just quickly found from Googling, and you can see it's really similar, but it's a little smaller. I liked that there were I statements here because it really puts the ownership on the individual owning it. And then I liked mixed feelings. That language I thought was really good. I have our LLC has an online project management class. And in our class, we encourage project managers to use this scale: love it, like it, live with it, or loathe it. Because so often when you're talking with teams, you don't have to love it. You just need to live with the decision. And then if you loathe it, have those conversations. We talked about this previously, but I just want to run back through some of these some of the benefits. So definitely something that can transform conflict because it's no longer for and against, but there's a whole spectrum of opportunities. The loudest voice doesn't win every time. Everyone feels heard. The person with the most power isn't making the decision. Graduate students can participate. And again, this is a great opportunity to practice diversity, equity, and inclusion by listening to more voices. So if we could launch that Zoom poll one more time, I'd like to hear from the audience. If you could answer this prompt, I could use the gradients of agreement with my team. I'll give you just a few more seconds to get your responses in. All right, I'm going to end this polling, share the results. All right, so a lot of it, okay, this looks like it might be something useful for you all. So that makes me happy that it's something you feel like you can use. So thank you for that. A couple of resources. This is the citation for the Kaner book that I've been holding up. And then as I was preparing for this conversation, the University of Michigan Extension Office has a wonderful step-by-step guide on how to use everything. And so finally, here's my contact information. But I hope that we have a few minutes that we can have a conversation here about how you would use this, modifications. If you all have any stories to share about how you have used this with your teams that were good, bad, ugly, I would love to hear them.
Great. Thank you so much, Hannah. We have at least one question in the chat, and please enter your other questions, dear audience members. We have a question from Marie France. Her question is, for some delicate questions, would it be better to have an anonymous pool or source of collecting responses, so everybody feels comfortable to share their level of acceptance.
I love Jamboards for this reason. So if Jamboards is a tool by Google, you can Google, I think it's google.jamboards.com, and they will have you come in, like when you are join the Jamboard, you're an animal, like an aardvark or a giraffe or a llama or an alpaca. And so you have no clue who anybody is. And I like this for facilitating because people will put their crazy ideas down and you have absolutely no clue who wrote them unless you're like, okay, who's the aardvark? So there's a time and a place and a tool for this.
And we have a request, Hannah, if you could please copy and paste the link from Michigan State Extension into the chat, that others would love to click on that resource and learn more. Any other questions?
I would have just to go a bit further on this anonymous versus non-anonymous question. I was wondering if sometime it would be like not recommended to go anonymous, so we can know who is not comfortable with some decisions. So is it like a tricky to go anonymous, so we don't really know who are the ally or not?
Yeah, I think a lot of these tools could easily be modified to put your name, just like the Google slide was write your name in it. And if you were using Jamboard, you could say, put a sticky note with your name on it. And so just tell people like, yeah, Jamboards are anonymous, but we want to know where you're standing. And so I think just adapting small adaptations to your instructions can change that.
Yeah, sure.
One last question, and maybe we'll just touch on this and then circle back to it. Peter asked in the chat, this is a very good question. If you have a large audience and most are in agreement, but a couple of people loathe it or veto, is there a risk that those substantial disagreements can overly influence the decision? Or what would you do, Hannah?
You know, I think if I was in person, I would pull the loathe at people aside. And I would send everyone else on a break and say, hey, can we have a conversation about what's going on? What are you hearing? What are you seeing? Let's find a way to package this and then bring it back to the full group. In a virtual setting, I think, again, you could send people off on a group, but out somewhere and have a break, but, figure out why they're loathing it. I think that's what's powerful about the gradients is you can really dive in and see what's going on and try and understand, okay, why does everyone else have this agreement and why does this group loathe it? Because typically if you're going through a process here, hopefully you're closer to the same page, especially, again, I'm going to hold up Kaner. If you start kind of on page 1 walking through it, hopefully people are engaged in the process from the beginning and someone on the same page. So again, maybe back up a few steps and then also pull that group aside and figure out what's going on.
And I'll jump in and offer that the next tool we're about to hear from Dr. Gabriele Bammer, who has recorded her presentation. The next tool is principled negotiation. It may really help with that kind of a situation to uncover what is the motive behind a very strong dissenting opinion, getting down away from the position of I hate it down to, well, what's really driving your interest here? So with that, please continue to brainstorm while I get my shared screen going here, and we're going to hear from Dr. Bammer. Maybe, again, the share screen. Are folks seeing the video? Excellent, thanks, Christine. Okay, I hope that the sound works. Please let me know.
It's not working, Bethany.
It's not working. You can go to the view options and you can activate the sound from there.
View options.
On the top.
Share sound. I hope it works.
So let me start by congratulating Bethany and Christine and Interreach for putting together this great seminar series. And I want to also apologise for not being with you in person, but I think you'll understand that the time difference between the US and Australia is not great and it would mean being up in the middle of the night. So I'm grateful to have been allowed to make a recording of this particular technique, which is one of my favourites for working together. It's a technique called principled negotiation, also known as getting to yes. And it was developed in the 1970s by a group at Harvard Law School, the program on negotiation. And I've been rather surprised to find that it's no longer as widely known as it was all those years ago. So principled negotiation is useful for finding a mutually agreeable, fair solution through a problem-solving approach. And it's really good for accommodating differences in interests and for resolving normal differences. It can also be used for conflict resolution, and it was in fact developed for that. When you use it for conflict resolution, it's often good to have an independent facilitator, but when you're using it to find an accommodation in interests in a non-conflictual situation where you've got disagreement but not conflict, it's something you can actually do yourself, and that's certainly the way that I've often used it. So I want to explain the principles through an example. I want to talk about Wendy and Craig, who both want to be the first author on a paper that will be submitted to the prestigious journal Nature. Wendy's the study principal investigator, or PI, and Craig is an early career researcher. Wendy's going to manage this negotiation. So in getting started, the most important thing is to resist the temptation to jump to a decision. Instead, what you need to do is you need to concentrate on the 4 steps of principled negotiation. The first is to separate the people from the problem. The second is to focus on interests, not positions. The third is to generate a variety of possibilities before deciding what to do. And the last one is to look for a fair solution based on the merits. So let's start with separating the people from the problem and what that means. What you're trying to get to is a situation where you're working side by side productively and looking at a way to overcome this problem together. It's a joint problem-solving exercise. To do that, you've got to deal with emotion, perception, and communication. In terms of emotion, you've got to worry about all sorts of emotions, not just negative ones like anger. You certainly have to deal with that if you're cross with each other. But you also need to worry about emotions like enthusiasm or sympathy, where you might give in too easily to the other person without looking after your own interests. Perception is understanding that each person's point of view is different, and you need to get into a position where you understand where each other is coming from. And finally, communication is all about active listening. It's not just about putting your own case, but it's actively understanding what the other person's interests are and how you might work together to resolve your disagreements around what should happen. So for Wendy, separating the people from the problem means putting aside her anger at John, who's Craig's mentor, because John's kind of been psyching Craig up to be a bit aggressive, and that's not being helpful at all in a whole lot of things in the project. She's also got to put aside her sympathy for Craig because she understands all too well what the challenges are for early career researchers in getting a rung on the tenure or getting onto that tenure ladder, right? And so she's got to balance all those emotional contexts in which she's operating. She's got to be able to put that to one side. She wants to understand Craig's point of view, and she also wants to make sure that he understands hers. And she's going to model active listening, and she's going to make sure that he is engaged in active listening too. And by approaching the problem side by side, they can actually discuss what active listening means and how to do it and whether they're doing it well. The second step is to focus on interests, not positions. So positions are the kind of dogmatic statements that we make about what we want. And you can helpfully see them as a summary statement of interests. And so what you need to do is you need to tease out the individual interests that are underneath. When you do that, you'll find that there's disagreement on only some interests, and there may well be other interests where you agree, and other interests again where that are not particularly problematic or in the context in which you're operating, and that can be put to one side. So when you've identified where the disagreements are, you need to frame a joint attack on those disagreeing interests. And to do that, you need to be able to treat each other with courtesy and respect. So when Wendy and Craig tease out their interests, they come up with something that looks like this. So for Wendy, the key thing is that being first author will help her promotion to full professor. For Craig, it will help his case with tenure. For Wendy, it'll give her a chance to think through some complex ideas. For Craig, it'll be a chance to implement his newly acquired paper writing skills. The paper's a grant deliverable for both of them. Wendy's also, underpinning it all, has favoured others on first authorship on other papers in the project, and she feels like it's her turn. Craig hasn't yet had a first authored paper on this project, and he's seen others get them, so he also feels like it's his turn. So when we look at those interests, we see that some are identical. So the paper as a grant deliverable is an identical interest for both of them. There are some interests that are not particularly dependent on first authorship. So Wendy can still think through the complex ideas regardless of whether or not she's first author, and Craig can still use his newly acquired writing skills regardless of whether or not he's first author. So where they conflict is in their career aspirations, the help that it'll give them for promotion or tenure, and in turn taking, where they both feel that it's their turn. When you put those together, you can also see that career advancement doesn't necessarily need to be a conflicting interest. It's possible for both of them to advance their careers, but not in this particular way. There is an issue with turn taking in the project as a whole. And you really need to look at, even though the first one is not necessarily a conflicting interest, you do need to look at both of them in trying to resolve this. And I'm sorry that my image is covering up some of the writing. I've tried to avoid that as much as I can on the slides. Because this authorship example is pretty complicated, I want to give you a much simpler example to illustrate the point from the Program on Negotiation website itself. The example they give is two siblings disagreeing on where to host their parents' anniversary party. Jenny says, I want to go to a restaurant. Jeff says, I want to have it at home. So when they talk to each other about why they want these particular outcomes, they start to get at their underpinning interests. So for Jenny, it's that she's time poor. She's got no time to help prepare. She's got no time to do the cleaning up afterwards. Jeff, on the other hand, is worried about the cost. He really wants to keep the costs contained, and by doing it at home, he thinks he can do that. So a compromise that they can come to quite easily is to do it in an inexpensive restaurant, so they can take care of both the time issue and the expense issue by looking at how to deal with both of those and finding a suitable restaurant. As I said, I wanted to give this example because this identifying interests is actually the key piece of this kind of negotiation, or is a key piece, and it's one that in the authorship example can be a bit difficult to tease out. So then let's move on to the third step, which is generating a variety of possibilities before deciding what to do. The idea here is to be creative. What you're really trying to do is to generate a bunch of solutions for the conflicting interests, not the other ones. And in doing that, there are 4 things that you have to avoid. So first of those is to not leap to a solution before you've considered all the options. And you'll remember that I cautioned against that right at the beginning. The second is searching for a single right answer. There are usually many ways that interests can be met. They're not all equally good, but there's not usually a single way and there's not usually a right way. They've all got strengths and weaknesses. The third thing to avoid is to assume that you're working within a set of rigid constraints. It's always worth stepping back a bit and saying, are there other resources that we can bring to bear? Or the way that they say it in the Getting to Yes book is there a way to expand the pie? So we're not just trying to divide up an existing set of resources. Let's see if we can bring more to the picture in trying to resolve this issue. And finally, you need to avoid not including everybody who's involved. So Wendy could not include Craig and just make a decision, for example. You have to treat it as a shared problem requiring a shared solution, and that way you're likely to get to a mutually satisfactory outcome. So back to Wendy and Craig. As I said, Wendy's kind of tempted to put her foot down and insist on first authorship. But she knows that if she does that, it could lead to open conflict with Craig and potentially also his mentor, John. She's also a bit tempted to just give in and let Craig be first author, but she knows that that would make her resentful because, again, she's giving someone else first authorship and not looking after her own needs. So what they now need to do together is to brainstorm the options. The idea here is to really not evaluate the ideas that come, but to put all ideas on the table, if you like. So one is to think about, so are there other ways to advance our careers? For the person who doesn't get first authorship, are there other things that could be done that would be useful? So seed funding or paid conference attendance or leadership training, there might be a whole range of things that could be done that would be satisfactory for one of the parties. Another option is to look at the project's overall publishing program. Is there a possibility for a second paper in a high-ranking journal so they could have one each? A third possibility is to split the paper in two. It mightn't be then publishable in Nature, but it might still be publishable in good journals. And the fourth option is, why don't we just ask Nature or another journal that would be equally good whether they would actually recognise joint forced authorship. That way we would both get what we were looking for. So once you've got a number of solutions on the table, you then need to look for a fair solution based on the merits. And you need to do that for each option, because remember, there's no one right answer. Instead, what you're looking for is all the options, all the pros and cons of each option, and then to find the one that is best in terms of being fair for both parties. So what you're looking for is a fair solution based on objective criteria. So that's also a challenging part. And objective criteria can be something like moral standards or equal treatment or scientific judgment or efficiency or cost or what the court would decide. Which objective criteria you use depends very much on the situation in which you're operating. And finally, what you're trying to achieve is that everybody's better off than their BATNA. BATNA, you ask? What's she talking about? So the BATNA is the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And what each party has to do is to work out the best outcome, that they could expect without negotiating. So if the negotiation didn't go ahead, what's the best that they could expect? And what you're trying to achieve is that each partner is doing better than that best outcome. So mostly you're not going to be able to achieve a perfect solution for each partner. So the aim, as I said, is for everybody to be better off than their BATNA. All right, back to Wendy and Craig. So the criteria for evaluating the options could include, how will this enhance my career prospects? The kind of criteria that we currently use on evaluating papers, so what actual contributions have you made to the paper or will be made to the paper, both in terms of time and intellectual contributions. There's also kind of the broader contributions to the project overall, again in terms of time and intellectual contributions. And it's worth also thinking a bit more laterally, even though these aren't necessarily as objective, but the things like what's it going to do to our relationships, the relationships of people working on this project, the kind of outcome that we get to. So for each of them, they need to consider what else is going to be good for their career. This is in terms of their VATNA, their best alternative to a negotiated agreement. They need to consider, so what else is going to be good for my career? Where on the paper, authorship list, would I end up? What's it going to do to my current and future relationships, both with each other and with the broader community that we're currently working with? And what's it going to do for my future opportunities to be involved in projects? Am I going to get a bit of a reputation here for being a certain kind of person, and maybe other people won't want to work with me, or if I'm a good they see that I'm a good problem solver, they might be more likely to want to work with me. So all of these things start to come into play. So Wendy might think, okay, if I can't get first authorship, then I really need something substantial to advance my career. For example, there's a leadership program that I really want to go to, and maybe I could trade off my first authorship against going to that. So that would be my best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So then, what are the options that we came up with? And so this is just a replication of the slide. And what you want to do now is work through each of these one by one. You don't necessarily have to work through them in the order that you came up with them in. And indeed, I'm going to suggest that we start with the last one, which seems pretty obvious when you think about it, which is, why not see if the journal will accept joint first authorship? If nature does, then the thing you have to do is to assess the contributions. Can we actually make a case to nature that joint authorship would be deserved? If yes, the problem's probably going to be solved with joint authorship. If no, then you need to go back to reviewing your other options. And you should review the other options anyway, because it might turn out that there's something that's better than this as an option. So then let's go to the one that gets to the heart of career prospects, which was the first option. Are there other ways to advance our careers? So looking at alternative rewards, if for the person who doesn't get first authorship, again, you can brainstorm a bunch of possibilities for each of the people. So what would be important to you that we might be able to do? And each person needs to consider their BATNA as part of that resolution of that brainstorming exercise. Then let's go to the second last one, which is to split the paper in two, so that there are two papers and each person gets a first authorship on one of them. So the trade-off here is that we're not in nature, but we're still in a good journal. So Wendy, for example, might lead a paper on theory or literature review, and Craig might lead one on methods. And this could work well if it matched their intellectual contributions and if there were reasonably good journals available for both, so that it would still meet the needs of advancing their careers. Then you want to look at the projects. The final option is, excuse me, looking at the project's overall publishing program and looking at whether there might be a second paper in a high-ranking journal to aim for. So this is a bit risky because the second paper may not happen, especially if it's a bit down the track. But if it looks like it might work, evaluate the contributions, time and intellectual, for both the paper that you're working on now and the paper that you're thinking about later. And you need to have some balance between the likely time and intellectual contribution between those two papers. And again, you need to consider your BATNAs. So in this example about paper authorship, you might now be scratching your head and asking yourself, so why don't we just look at their contributions, which is what universities said we should do, and avoid all this effort? There are some reasons, good reasons, I think, for doing this. First is that the contributions that people make are rarely completely straightforward. The second is that generating options is potentially more respectful and can lead to a real win-win. And the third is that we're not actually just looking at paper authorship, we're also looking at career prospects. And by taking this bigger approach, we get this bigger issue on the table, and we can really expand the pie in ways of thinking about those career options and do more than just think about paper authorship as two people or as a team as a whole, and really rev up the discussion in the team. And the BATNet as well can uncover other interests and motivations. And again, it can lead to a much more productive, rich conversation in a team and really make the teamwork more rewarding all round. So the final points I want to make are that this only works if the parties are genuine in looking for a fair solution. It needs creativity in generating options and thinking outside the box. And as I said right at the beginning, if you're actually in a situation where there's already conflict, then a facilitator might be useful. So here's a list of references which the slides can be made available, and you're very welcome to follow them up. And if you look at the internet, you'll find a bunch of videos on YouTube. You'll find a bunch of other references about this method of greater or lesser degree of involvement and difficulty. Given that I'm not there to answer questions, do please feel free to email me. With a bit of luck, you've got 5 or 10 minutes for discussion amongst yourselves, which I hope Bethany can lead. And finally, if you're interested in more tools as well as the ones that Bethany is putting together, there are some on the I2S website. If you don't already know about the I2 Insights, the Integration and Implementation Insights blog, there's a link there to that, and I'd really welcome contributions from people. There's a LinkedIn group that also shares methods, and Twitter is also a good way of sharing methods, and my email address is there again. Thank you all again very much for this opportunity to participate, and I hope you have a productive thinking about this wonderful tool, and I would be pleased to answer questions that you may have. I won't be able to answer them immediately because right now I'm asleep. Thanks again. Bye.
Great. Thank you so much, Gabrielle. I know you're not here to hear us clap, but we are very, very grateful. Please, if you know Gabrielle, or if you don't, reach out to her and on Twitter or by email and thank her for sharing her time and going through the extra effort to pre-plan days in advance to have the recording ready for us. So we do have that bit of luck with a few minutes left in our time together. And I want to open it up for questions live. If you want to unmute yourself or raise your hand, I can queue things up or enter questions in the chat, either about Gabrielle's tool or about conflict transformation in general. What came up for you?
I always like to wait a few minutes to see if somebody else's voice wants to come in, but I really liked the idea of having a methodical way to sort through the trade-offs and the differences of opinion. Because one of the things that's hard for me in finding consensus is sometimes if you really do have a distribution of wants and then that becomes on display to everyone, it's hard to wrap a bow around it and be like, well, I guess we're going with one of them, because then it just makes people feel disenfranchised, or it's not as easy as saying consensus exists or not, which is why I really like the gradient that you brought, Hannah. But I don't know, I think for me, it's always that game time. How do I deal with the fact that there are actually conflicting ideas in the room, and who do I give voice to, and how do I cut through the power dynamics to allow these kind of merit-based or, methodical negotiations to happen? So I felt like these are good tools that I could write down and practice.
Thanks, Christine. We even had Cassie, you mentioned in the chat, she is ready to use this at 1 o'clock today, like headed straight into being useful.
I'd like to jump in. I've been reflecting a lot on not only my past experiences in academia, which at this point have been over a considerable time, but also some newer undertakings that I have and what I have reservations against because of the long history I have in various kinds of environments and climates. And I want to throw out something that I've been thinking about, which is, it seems to me, we just had a recent presentation in one of our learning journeys from somebody who, he's actually the founder of Future Research, and he was talking about his PhD was so lovely, and he just thought being in science was absolutely fabulous, and it was in Cambridge in England. And then he came to Harvard for his postdoc, and he didn't realize it could be so bad, right? That there could be so much hidden conflict, etc. And it occurs to me that we either are lucky enough to be in what are adult situations where people are sorted out enough in their personalities that they're operating on we're all on the same train here, and we're actually trying to do science, and we're excited about it, and we love Pi Day, and like just all those really great things that get us geared up as scientists. And what occurs is that if you aren't or haven't been in one, you don't know they exist. So there's not this center of gravity to change. The labs and personalities that are working more from an immatured space where the goals are very childish, but it's not really explicit because it's adults doing it. So I've really been looking at this very compartmentalization about what level we're operating on, and that if you haven't experienced both, you don't know both exist. And so these very mature tools, like something that's been around, and I think I joined this group in the last year about conflict resolution since the 70s, like what a maturing way to somehow grow out of those pockets of really childlike behaviors. I'll stop now.
Thanks, Kenan, for sharing that it resonates with your long experience. We're seeing some of that as well in the chat. Alyssa sharing, sometimes people don't even want to do the principal negotiation because they don't want to do negotiation at all. But Christina is sharing maybe this language of transformation can reframe what the goal is, that we're not necessarily trying to resolve something that to them, of course, seems intractable, but transform it into something that could be tractable.
This is Elizabeth. I wanted to add to the pool of dialogue the understandable human tendency to get into physical stress when there's conflict, and that creates fight or flight. So I think maturity, Kenan, is learning to work with our own body so that we can stay out of that fight or flight. But I also think that seeing it as fight or flight and naming it as fight or flight instead of character failure can really help. And I really love, Hannah, this gradient thing is making me really sparkly. So thank you for that.
Elizabeth, that reminds me of Anne's presentation last month about deep listening, where she actually had us pause and get into our bodies a little bit to center them. And we can see, right, how deep listening, or at least the 4 levels of listening, could play a role in our 2 tools today. We're about out of time, and I just want to invite you to put 1 word into the chat about how you are feeling or what is at the top of your mind heading out of today's IntoReach webinar and into the rest of your day. A 1-word whip around the chat. And a big thank you to Christine for setting up the Zoom room and the polls, to Hannah and to Gabrielle, and to all of you. Again, thank you for bringing your energy and attention to our community as we continue to learn together. Come back next month, the 2nd Tuesday. We're going to be talking about another topic that I don't remember, but it's going to be great. Watch for the announcements and head to the IntoReach website for the event. Thanks all.
Thanks so much, Bethany. Bye, everyone.